Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, Black English, Black Accent. Can you identify someone's race by only listening to the way they speak? Can you identify someone's race by the way they pronounce words? Can you identify someone's race by the way they pattern a spoken phrase? Now, most of us would likely say we can identify accents based on race, based on racial bias, or based on exposure, or based on stereotype. But during the O.J. Simpson murder trial, defense attorney Johnnie Cochran challenged a police officer for hearing a black voice in the night. When Johnnie argued in court, it was racist to ascribe someone's way of speaking to their race. How, Johnnie Cochran asked in open court, is it possible to know a black man is yelling far away from you in the dark of night without relying on racial stereotypes to fit your conclusion? That moment in open court was uncomfortable, and likely legally right. But that didn't stop the start of a discussion about race in America, and about history and regionality, as well as speech patterns and slang and cultural identification that lives beyond the skin and in the voice box and mouth, and also about the things that are expelled in pronunciations. I ask you, is it racist to say, that guy sounds black, without actually seeing him in person? Is there a stereotypical Asian accent that works the same way? Traditionally, white people from the Midwest have been and are valued in broadcast television for having no discernible accent that can be tied to the Northeast or South or the sunny West Coast. People seem to like bland speakers on television. Now, is that a racial bias? Preferring the bland, preferring dead, flavorless speech, just because it has no cultural or geographic declarations in the prescribed syntax and grammar? Is a Boston accent, or an Irish brogue, or a Cockney accent all just as racially power-packed and stereotypical as Johnnie Cochran's open court contempt for a black voice in the night? These are all interesting questions and important wonderings as we compress as a people of the world, where region and culture and separating differences are no longer valued, and where the ordinary, the bland, and the homogeneous are given great power in equalizing the world into an unbiased cultural cesspool of sameness and ubiquity. When I was young and growing up in the accentless Midwest, a book called Black English was published in 1973, written by J.J. Dillard. And the book argued there was actually a researchable scientific thing called black speech, sometimes known as Ebonics back then. And black speech identified patterns of speech with racial tropes. And the New York Times Review of Books said about that Black English book,
"It is a highly readable, usable, and extremely timely discussion of the language system and habits of African Americans in previous and current times."
Now, that Black English book had its early fans and its late haters. As a young and impressionable child, without much exposure to Black English, I thought the book asked interesting questions about identity and culture and skin color. And then, 25 years later, Johnny Cochran would use the black English argument against the white establishment in an attempt to prove in court institutional racial bias on the part of the Los Angeles Police Department. And let's remember, race is and has always been only about one thing: the color of your skin. Race has nothing to do with religion or region or nationality or education or intellect or culture. Simply put, your race is the color you are. Or, as an old Toshiba computer design friend of mine once said 25 years ago, there's a Japanese word used to describe the color of materials used to create computers. Let's say the color of a computer chassis that is not related to paint. My friend went on to explain. The phrase translates into the color that it is, or perhaps more simply, the color of it is the color of which it is made. Or maybe now, I wonder, even more simply and much more insensitive, might translate into this: its color is its race. Would Johnny Cochran agree with that insulting simplicity? Can a computer have an inherent color based on science and mechanics? Johnny Cochran might answer yes, but only if that argument fit into his murder narrative. No matter what historical argument is made, we do judge people on how they speak. Is a Jamaican accent a black accent? What about a Bronx accent, a Brooklyn accent, a Puerto Rican or Dominican accent? Is there a speech pattern associated with the inner city American ghetto? And yes, I know ghetto is now an unfavored word, but we're talking tropes and stereotypes, and yes, universal slandering in this concoction of an argument. So you know what I mean. There is a concept called deaf speech, and you've likely heard it. How deaf people speak with their voice after speech therapy. Some argue deaf speech is instantly recognizable to even the untrained ear. But is deaf speech identifiable beyond the assumption? Point of truth. Some of the best deaf speech imitators are hearing people, just like some of the best lip readers around are hearing people. It makes sense, right? Hearing is both a gift and a weapon, and many of us cannot discern the difference between a cudgel and a coupon. You can also peg a deaf person regionally based on the hand shapes and signs they use to communicate. The Southern deaf use different glossings and code switching than do the deaf in the West, East Coast, and Midwest. It's all regional. It isn't racial. But by watching, you can mark the origin of a deaf signer based on syntax and visuals alone. Would Johnny Cochran approve? Unlikely. Do you remember Nigger Jim in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Did he speak with a written accent on the page? Was Mark Twain a racist for writing Jim against his skin color? Or was Mark Twain trying to reflexively argue against slavery in his time? please go to bolesblogs.com and look for my article, Taking the Nigger Out of Jim, to learn about censoring the Huck Finn book by a publisher who chose to remove the offensive words from the book, nigger and Injun. Sometimes the reality of what was is so horrible, we need to remember it, even in print, and especially in a children's book. Now I ask you about Uncle Remus. He's been banned as insensitive because of racial speech in some parts of the United States. Is Uncle Remus racist? Or do his stories and speech patterns represent the Old South and the rise of the Civil War? Do we value the knowing, or do we value the never knowing? Is the very act of phonetically typing an accent on the page a major racial insult? Where do we draw the fine, bright line between insult and learning? Predicting human speech patterns is a science, not a totem of faith, and Professor Jeffrey Hines of the University of Delaware argued this in print in early 2017. Hines described an English-speaking person being asked to invent a new word. That person might come up with bling, B-L-I-N-G, a word that actually was created fairly recently, but that same person would not make up a word like jidding, G-D-I-N-G. The BL sound in bling is a common speech pattern in English, while the GD in gding is not. Although other languages do use that sound. Poland, for example, has a city called Gdańsk. Hines has analyzed this range of speech patterns computationally and found it's simpler than we thought, he said. And that can help us predict patterns in human language. And it also helps us see how we learn. So we can scientifically predict speech and inflective patterns. But is it right to tie those conclusions to race or place or an identifiable pattern? We may be able to sense an Eastern European accent, but is it Russian or Polish or Germanic? It may not matter in the end, but it does matter in the immediate to the identity of the speaker, because a culture is preserved by its language. And now we circle back to the original point of this podcast, of determining race, skin color, by sound alone. Can a person with an accent change their accent to imitate and perhaps indict someone else? Vocal impersonation has always been a fine entertainment staple in Las Vegas. But in the courtroom, under oath, and in the field, and working as a sworn officer of the law, Johnny Cochran may very well have been right. That it is disingenuous and dangerous and impossible to indelibly connect a pattern of speech to a skin color. Even though we've been doing precisely that for the last 1,000 years. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.